Hello everyone, it's Tom from Besser Builds, and today we're going to be building a modern mantel for a fireplace out of solid cherry. It's a pretty simple build, and we'll take you through it step by step. Nothing can possibly go wrong. Like every project, this one's going to start with the drawings. Now this mantel we're going to go ahead and build out of cherry. The house has poplar trim in it already, but poplar and cherry can be kind of interchangeable once stained, and cherry has a better grain, so we're going to go with that for this project. I'm going to actually custom match the color later on. But as you can see here, we're going to start by getting these pieces down to a more manageable size so we can go ahead and start milling out this lumber. So with the length of these boards, I don't actually have a planer sled built that's long enough. So I'm just gonna go ahead and start by skip planing, which is just kind of going back and forth, taking a little off each side. And you're gonna get a relatively flat board out of this if you do it right. But of course you have to start with relatively flat lumber. It's really hard to get a twist out with skip planing, if not completely impossible. So keep that in mind. One thing you'll notice is that I upgraded my planer to have the Helix cutter head, which is an absolute game changer for this tool. Also, I took advantage of my space and I went ahead and built it into one long workbench along the whole distance. This almost eliminates snipe completely and has made the whole process of planing way easier. And I spent a ton of time on this machine, so it was well worth it. So after going ahead and getting this plane down to its final thickness, which was kind of an arbitrary number in this case, it doesn't have to be anything specific, I went ahead and took it over to my track saw. I don't have a joiner, but using planing sleds or skip planing and a track saw has really done me well on a ton of projects. A joiner obviously would be nice to have, but when you're in a smaller space and you have to make sacrifices, that's kind of the one tool you can go ahead and sacrifice. Now that I have two parallel sides in one 90-degree straight line, I can go ahead and run this through the table saw and get my final dimensions so that I have S4S lumber. After that, I can go ahead and make my measurements to know where I need to cut my miter. And unfortunately, the footage of me cutting this miter, I buried next to Jimmy Hoffa. So just take my word for it. I cut a 45-degree angle on the side of this board. So one thing that was important to the customer on this mantel and another one that I built for him was the idea of grain wrap. When you're going to do a grain wrap, you have to be really specific when you cut these miters. You have one shot. You can't mess up. And if you do, you're basically, your board's ruined for this project. You got to start over. So you really need to dial these in, take your time, double, triple check, and cut everything right the first time. So now when I cut these miters, which are going to be 30 degrees, and this is 5-inch tall stock, I'm going to use the most accurate tool I have in my entire shop for cutting miters, which is the miter saw. And that might surprise some people, even though it's in the name. You can 100% cut perfect miters on a miter saw just as well, if not better, in a lot of cases better than on a table saw. I'm about to show you right here. Now my big hairy dumb arm is in the way through most of this, but I wanted to include it just so everyone knows there's no smoke and mirrors. This is how I actually cut these cuts. So the very first cut I made is the cut that's going to make contact with the wall. I just cut that as a 45, and the reason is I want a little bit of a back bevel so that if I have to scribe to the wall, it's much easier to do so. Also gives you the ability to have a tighter fit. From there, I'm going to measure over to my first cut, which will be a 30-degree cut. You'll see me go through there, and I'm going to swing the saw over to make my second cut. And I'm going to remove as little material as possible between the two cuts. I should only lose about 1/8 due to the curve of the blade, which hopefully shouldn't impact the grain much, especially because there's not a whole lot going on in the grain in this specific area. Now, as you can see here, because I'm cutting this like baseboard up against the fence rather than flat on the table of the saw and using the bevel function, I'm able to get a really square cut, and I can do that consistently. A lot of it is arm control. You don't want to push on the saw one way or the other to cause any deflection. But if you can get this down, you can actually make super accurate cuts over and over and over again, and you can get up to the capacity of the saw as far as miters go. One thing that's really important here is that you have to have a quality miter saw. They're not all the same, they're not all created equal. If you're prioritizing space savings or dust collection and things like that, sometimes you're going to get a saw that is really just a bit junk. And accuracy is the most important when it comes to this tool. If you don't have an accurate miter saw, it's worthless. Just get rid of it, use a circular saw, track saw, anything but that. You need a really solid, accurate miter saw. Obviously, this DeWalt, I've been using this. I've cut miles and miles of trim work and everything else with this saw. It's a fantastic saw. Makita makes a great saw. Festool if you want to spend way too much money, but you really can't go wrong with DeWalt. It's kind of what they do. They make great saws. So now you finally have a view here without my big stupid arm in the way. And as you can see, it's just as simple as just taking your time, working through those cuts, making sure you're not pushing on the blade one way or the other, and you're gonna get a great result. That glowing DeWalt review I just gave, I'm not sponsored by them, but I could be, you know. Yeah, me. Let's talk, DeWalt. So as I work my way through the rest of these cuts, 30-degree miters, as you'll notice, I continue to keep moving along, taking the minimal amount of material possible. And in this last cut, I finish up with another 45 for the same reason, to give me a bit of a back bevel on the final piece. When it's all said and done, the total length of this mantle ends up being 88¼ inch. And honestly, that length would be very difficult to cut on a table saw. Absolutely impossible in my shop because I just don't have the room to make that long of a cut on my table saw. So even if I wanted to, I couldn't do it. But as you can see here coming up, that the miter saw did an absolutely perfect job on this. So here you can go ahead and see this grain wrap and how these miters come together. There's no glue yet and nothing's clamped together. These are literally just sitting on my workbench, and you couldn't get any better if you tried. So to do this glue up, I'm gonna go ahead and use strapping tape instead of blue tape. I've had blue tape sometimes cut right on the edge because these miters can be really sharp. This strapping tape's much stronger. It's got a little bit more flexibility to it. And on top of that, I'm going to use these Collins spring clamps. They have little points on them, and the divot that they leave usually can be ironed out, but you really can't see it in the final product anyways. But they're an awesome way to clamp these kind of weird miters that otherwise you couldn't get a clamp on. You really get a chance here to see how well that grain wrap actually comes together. At a certain point, it almost is like that line just disappears. It's just like one solid piece of wood that you bent rather than you cut. When you go ahead and glue this together, you want to kind of definitely get your glue in there because you got a lot of end grain going on. It's a plenty strong joint, but you also want to be cognizant that you don't have too much squeeze out at the front. The one joint here I kind of dropped the ball on, and there's definitely some squeeze out, but I can take care of that in sanding later. Usually you would go ahead and burnish these, but honestly in this case these came together so well, pat myself on the back here, that I had no reason to burnish these whatsoever. Plus 30-degree angle is not as sharp as a 45, so less likely to chip. 45 degrees though, you kind of want to burnish at least a little bit just to keep them from chipping down the road or being so sharp that you get cut. Here you see these Collins spring clamps I was talking about. These are more of a finished carpentry tool, but they definitely have applications in woodworking as well. The one thing I can tell you is this is not where you want to get the Amazon knockoff. Those tend to be absolutely terrible, and I don't know why. Definitely just go ahead and spend your money, get the name brand. You're going to be way happier. They're not that expensive in the long run. I've got a pack of them that I've been using for years. Fantastic product. Definitely want to buy it. So as you can see here, everything just came together really tight. A lot of people like to cut a 46 instead of a 45, and you get a little bit of a gap in the back. In this case, you only have 3 sides to this box. That would be a big no-no. You're going to get an incorrect angle. And when you do have these miters cut perfect with no gaps, it's a surprisingly strong joint. I know people knock it all the time, but this needs no reinforcement. It's going to be just fine. The one downside of these Collins clamps is sometimes when you take them off, they'll just spring all the way back down the tool, and they'll get you in the thumb. And they always get you in the cuticle, the part of your thumb you don't want to have cut, and you end up bleeding. It happens maybe like once or twice when I'm trimming a house out, like throughout the whole house. It'll get me once. I haven't figured out exactly why it does it, but this time I didn't get cut, but you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Once again, last time I'm going to pat myself on the back, but you can just see how well this grain wrap and this miter came together. Once again, you don't need a table saw to cut perfect miters. A miter saw will actually cut perfect miters. I know this is a surprise to some people, but it's just the way it is. Just got to know how to use the tool. So what you're seeing me do here is you're seeing me take the top, and I'm going to go ahead and trace out the shape of the piece I just made onto the top so that it's exact. But I'm not going to completely cut to the line because I want to come back with a flush trim bit, and I want to make this fit perfectly. That'll all make sense here as we go through this process, but this right here is really what's important to get all of these miter wraps folds to come together so it looks like one solid piece of wood. Unfortunately, the sawmill I get my lumber from did not have a single piece of cherry on hand that was wide enough to make this piece one piece, so I did have to do a glue up. After I go ahead and dye the wood, you're going to see it really kind of blends a little bit better, and there's going to be things on this mantle. So in this particular case, it's not a big deal, but it's really not ideal. I wasn't happy about this, but I had to do what I had to do in this particular case. So what I'm doing here is I'm cutting some blocks at the exact height, which is 5 inches of this base piece. The reason is because these mitered edges can get really, really delicate, and I don't want to clamp anything to that mitered edge directly. So what I'll do is I'll take some CA glue, I'll just glue these blocks on the back, and that'll give me a place to put clamps so I can secure this tight enough to go ahead and take a router to it. So as you can see here, this is just how this all works out with the blocks and the clamps, and this just kind of keeps everything nice and tight without damaging that delicate mitered edge. You can see here I'm just going ahead and using a trim router, and I'm going to chuck up a white side flush trim bit. These are fantastic. They're spiral cutter bits. Once you've gone to these, you'll never go back to the cheap ones you get at the big box stores. Absolutely fantastic tool. Alright, so what you're going to see here is a bit of a mistake on my part. I really didn't cut this close enough because I wasn't really sure how it was all going to work out once it was clamped. And my idea was I was going to take this flush trim bit and just kind of chip away at the edge until I got closer. What actually happened was the bit just pulled straight in and started to cut. And I was stuck in a predicament where I didn't want to take these clamps off and recut and then have what I had already cut not match back up. So I decided just to send it. I don't advise this. Obviously you want to take off minimal amounts with the router, but in this particular case, just hey, here goes everything. Just let it go. Sometimes that happens in woodworking. Obviously don't do it this way, cut a little closer to that line, but it worked out for me in the end. The bit just screamed a little bit the whole time. Be glad I don't have that sound playing in the background. It was horrible. When you're doing this, it's basically just take your time, cut a little bit, move your clamp, cut a little bit, move your clamp. Last thing you want is for this to move because any little flaw is going to show up right on that mitered edge. Just take your time, move the clamps as you go, use plenty of them. This kind of has to be perfect because, like I said, if there's any flaws, it's going to show up on this mitered edge, and that's the last place you want to have a flaw. When it's all said and done, you should have one board that is the exact same shape as the base below. And from here, you can go ahead and start working on getting the miters cut on this. Now that we're done getting the top cut to size, we can go ahead and just pop off these blocks that I made. They leave a little bit of residue behind. You can come back with sandpaper or anything. I think I use a chisel to clean most of it up. So now I'm going to go ahead and leave that flush trim bit in, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to two-side tape some 1/2-inch plywood down on the base of this, and I'm going to trim that to fit the exact same size as the top. Okay, so the footage of me actually cutting the chamfer on this, I managed to bury it next to the Holy Grail. But you can see me setting up the router table here, and truthfully I should have just set up a router and took the tool to the work instead of the work to the tool. But I had these new Jessen stock guides and, you know, all this extra space. I wanted to try it out and it worked. But if I did it again, I would definitely just chuck up my router. I was just being lazy. The big thing is you need a very big chamfer bit, like huge. And so yeah, that's a big chunk of steel there that we're going to be spinning. But honestly, it does a fantastic job. And this took me all like a couple of minutes to get all three sides chamfered perfectly. So all the hard work's done now. Everything's cut. Now you're gonna see me start to dry fit this. I'm gonna start to work my way through how I'm gonna actually clamp everything up and do the glue up process. So that's basically a big chunk of this thing is getting this glue up right. And then from there, you're pretty much, it's easy going. You can see here how tight everything really comes together. There's a little bit of bow in the boards, and you're gonna be able to sort that out through clamps when you're gluing it up. This is to be expected. So to be completely honest, this glue up got a little bit stressful. And at the end of the day, the camera got shut off. I did what I had to do to get the job done right. But as you can see here, there's a lot of clamps going in two different directions. It's just a finesse thing. Squeeze a little here, squeeze a little there, get it all as close and as tight as you possibly can, and then just let it be overnight. So you can see the end result. Everything's fairly tight. You may have a little gap here and there. It's kind of normal to be expected. And we're gonna go over how to close those up. But honestly, this is pretty close to ideal as far as a glue up with all of these miters like this. So here you can see things got a little bit gappy on the end here, and it did on both ends. Maybe I just got a little bit small. I don't know if it was when I did the chamfer or the flush trim. Anyways, it's a pretty simple fix. What you're gonna do is called burnishing. And you're gonna take a round steel object, something hard, preferably no machine marks in it, like a screwdriver. I actually have a burnishing tool for burnishing card scrapers that I use. But all you're doing is you're kind of rounding these edges and you're pushing them together. And that's gonna close up any gaps, and then you come back and you hit it with a little bit of sandpaper. I like these sand sponges because they perform really well. And when it's all said and done, those 64th inch gaps, probably less than that, they close up beautifully and it just looks like the wood all grew together. Basically, I continued this process the whole way down the piece. And there wasn't a lot to close up, but still burnishing that edge is important, and you get a really nice finish when it's all said and done. Here's the part we all hate, and that's sanding. Basically, I'm gonna spare you from watching the whole thing. I start at 120, I take it down to 220, and just nice hard pad. I'm not rounding any edges over, that's all. Here you go, nice finished work. Horrible camera work, but it sanded well. Alright, so let's talk about the color match. Basically, you have an eye for it or you don't. I can't give you any tips. I used to make soft plastic baits and fishing jigs and things like that, so I really have a good eye for color. I got this mix-all dye, and basically, I usually do like 12 ounces at a time, and it's just kind of a trial and error. Experience. I don't know what else to tell you. I have no pro tip here. Just do it until you figure it out. Little goes a long way. And just kind of keep testing as you go, and don't be afraid to throw it out and start over. When it comes to applying this dye, I like to use a foam brush. I've sprayed it, but it seems to always go on a little bit too heavy, even with an HVLP. The biggest thing is just you don't want to have those stop and start marks. So you want to maintain a wet edge. You'll see me keep going back over it over and over again. Just basically you're trying to get a nice smooth finish. Then you let it dry for 24 hours, and then I highly recommend you do a spray finish, because like a rub-on finish, like a Odie's oil or Rubio, sometimes I can lift the stain out of the wood, and then you get a much lighter product than what you want. You'll see my pup in a few shots here. He's a pit bull. He's about to turn 11, and unfortunately, we just lost his sister, my black lab. She was 14. She died a week ago, and he's basically living in the shop and living with me. And he's sick, but he's not abused. But he's living his best life right now, spending all his time in community. So you can see now all the dye is drying. It's a bit blotchy because it's not completely dry. But you can see it dries a lot lighter than what you think it's going to be. But once you spray the finish on there, it darkens up real nice. There's a whole lot going on the day that I actually sprayed this, so I didn't get any footage of it. Plus, I didn't want to have my camera in the spray shop. Basically, I sprayed 3 coats of semi-gloss lacquer. Lacquer's pretty idiot-proof. I'm an idiot, so the more I can idiot-proof it, the better. And it's a great durable finish. And here you can see the final install. The customer's thrilled. They actually threw a tip on beyond the price. I'm happy with how it turned out. As you can see, it matched the trim and the crown very well. All in all, great project. I hope you learned a lot. Be sure to like and subscribe, and look forward to the next video. Thanks. Bye.